Cyclone Sam, coming at you. Cyclone is well and truly past. In fact, by the time it made landfall, it's not even a cyclone, but we are still dealing with the implications. And it's hard to talk about those without it sounding like a complaint. And I don't really want to complain, but part of this activity that we're doing here is for me to wax lyrical about what's going on in my life. And the last week of my life, at least, has been very cyclone heavy. To be specific, we don't have power. Haven't had power for the last 8 days. We haven't been here for the last 8 days, so haven't had to deal with that, although we have had to deal with the implications, which is the fridge defrosted, we lost all our food, ruined some of the floorboards in the kitchen. That wasn't fun. Larger amounts of damage to the roof of our house. Nothing major. No one has been hurt, thankfully. And we're not the only ones that are without power, and we're not the only ones that have had some damage to our property. But you do tend to be self-interested, and because the implications are still being felt, it's very topical. Last night, for example, the generator, which we had and I since returned this morning, it crapped out at about 4 a.m. this morning, which meant I was up at 4 a.m. trying to restart it, which meant that I was up at 4 a.m. So today will either be terrible, as I have to search deep and long to find my thoughts, and I've found my thinking a little impaired over the last few days, as sleep hasn't been great for a while now, or it could present as excitable and manic, and maybe we'll have a little bit of fun. Time will tell. To everyone that has reached out to say, I'm glad you're not hurt. I'm glad your family's all together. Hope you're doing okay. I appreciate that. What I appreciate even more is the positive feedback that I've received related to this podcast. So anytime someone says, hey, keep going, I say thank you, and I will. Or if someone says, this is how your podcast has positively impacted me, that spurs me on to keep doing this. All feedback is appreciated. No, I wouldn't say all feedback. Some people say they provide feedback like, hey, I had a podcast a while back and it failed, but you should do this. That's not as useful. How a podcast is conducted is in part a matter of taste, and someone else's preferences might not be my own or even those of the people I'm trying to speak to. There has been some good tidbits in there, but be certain that I am trying to constantly evolve and improve. And so the faults that you notice in this process, I notice them too. And I'm trying to remedy those. It will get better over time, as I believe today will be better than last week. Next week will be better than this week. And those of you that are listening, thanks for being here. What's been curious is when I say something like, hey, send in a question for the podcast, and I hear like, I'm glad your cat's okay. I'm glad you found your cat, which is nice to hear, but also not what I'm asking for. The well wishes with regards to my family situation is positive, but it's probably not as appreciated as the feedback that I get related to the podcast, because the situation with our living circumstances is just a bit of a shit sandwich, and there's nothing to do but to eat it. And so when I hear something along the lines of, oh, I hope you're doing okay with that shit sandwich, it's just not super productive, but I appreciate that it comes from a good place. I've said appreciate a lot, so that's what I'm feeling, despite circumstances being not great. Not having power for 8 days is frustrating. And I've gone through phases of it, but let's take it back to the beginning. The last time I spoke with you was a week ago, and that at that point in time, I was about to abandon ship. And what was very front of mind was preparing our house for the worst, which looked like flooding may occur. So got my family out last Thursday. Then on the Friday, well, Thursday and Friday, I spent the time that I had moving everything in our home to an elevated position. So basically above waist level with the understanding that there could be some flooding. So let's take everything, and especially everything valuable, and elevate it. Which thankfully wasn't required, but happy to do because we didn't get flooding. What we did get was no power from last Thursday, and then we got lots of wind. So there's some damage to the roof, and there's debris everywhere. I've been picking it up the last couple of days. There's still a lot to do, but we're inching in that direction. The time away from home was positive in so many ways, and that we had somewhere to go. That's great. We drove about 6 hours down the coast and were able to be there for a couple of days. That's where our cat, Ladybug, went missing for a day, which wasn't great. But it was good, of course, to not have to be here because I believe that the wind was quite harrowing, as my neighbor described it, harrowing, which just doesn't sound positive. And of course, you don't want to have a baby and a toddler in that situation, let alone your wife or even myself. So we got out because there's nothing to be done about wind or flooding as compared to a bushfire. If there were a bushfire, there's some chance you could fend it off with a garden hose. But a flood, not so much. So semi-reluctantly, we got out and we went down the coast and then up the coast to some accommodation that was an Airbnb that was provided by our insurance. We could hang out there for a couple of days to figure out what the status was at home and when we could go home. First few days, most of what I was doing is repeatedly checking the weather, checking the news, which after a while, I realized that the news, what they were incentivized to do was to make it seem as catastrophic as possible to basically get engagement, which is not exactly the most positive thing if you're trying to get factual information as to what the actual status is. We knew well enough that we'd lost power, and when the weather was still bearing down, shitload of rain, shitload of wind, no power, it made no sense to go home. But where we were down the coast was close enough to be closer to home, but still close enough that we were impacted by the cyclonic weather. So the wind and rain and conditions where we were, Coffs Harbour, for those curious, was pretty shit also. So we're really limited in terms of access to our stuff. But when you've got a baby and a toddler and it's pissing down, there's only so much you can do because you need to get out. And with training priorities for myself, but limited training equipment, even some of the questions are, okay, I've got 2 pairs of running shoes, but if I run today and run tomorrow and they're both saturated, then the next couple of days might be limited, especially if there's high humidity, rain, not much scope for those to be able to dry, which I don't know if any of this is interesting, but these are some of the practical implications for us as a family, but also my training, which I mentioned last week, is never not a priority, but it certainly did get pushed to the back burner. Largely because there was less time because there were more important things. And that being the case, the time that was available may allow space to go for a run, but not necessarily to do the stuff that I would normally do and encourage others to do, which would help complement and sustain the running portion of the training. So warming up, taking care of your body. It meant having to pick and choose because with my wife taking care of the kids, if I'm training, someone has to do that. So it was a real um, liberty for me to be able to take the time to go for a run, but to take the time to be stretching and kind of dilly-dallying to any degree felt incredibly selfish. I'm not sure if you can hear the kookaburras here, but I certainly can. So it meant that training was minimized, as was the stuff that would normally sustain my training. So it was patchy. I got some in and I felt way better mentally every time that I did, but it was basically maintenance at best. In addition to the limited training, sleep was shot to shit because we were in different places and there was obviously a lot on my mind. I, over time, started to get a little bit sick, nothing major, but my son, he's been carrying some congestion and probably a daycare thing, which impacted me. So we've got minimal time, shit sleep, a bit of sickness, less training, and higher stress meant that my appetite also went to shit. There's also less access to good food because of all the changes, and also because a lot of the supermarkets, hours in either direction from our place, were just pillaged for healthy food. The fresh food that we would normally have was not available. So normally I would need to eat a fair amount to sustain myself and my training, but a lot wasn't available. I mean, there was food that was available, but I'd rather eat nothing than eat some bullshit. So a lot of the time it was nothing, which meant that my intake probably halved, which I've lost a couple of kilos, but hasn't helped the training in of itself, hasn't helped my immunity. But I think we're maybe starting to turn the corner, although, as I mentioned, the sleep last night was shit, and it's been shit the last couple of nights because first night home, no power, meant no AC, no fan. The last couple of nights we've had a generator, which meant one fan, which is so much better than nothing. It means the difference between no sleep and some sleep. But it's not been great. And all of this feels a bit complaining, and I hate it. But that's what's been going on. We suspect it's a Friday here that the power is supposed to be on by Sunday. If it's on before then, great. If it's uh, if it's not, there's nothing we can do anyway. And I know this because I've really tried to contact all of the necessary people without basically asking my followers to badger the company that fixes the power lines, who, by all accounts, the men that are on the ground that are dealing with the problems, they've been working their tits off. And I don't want to, have anyone that feels like they've been working hard properly to feel as though I have an issue with how they've gone about it. But the communication's been terrible, and there is this sense of feeling like we're living all of a sudden in a developed country. And as many of you would know, I've spent a good chunk of my life living in the US, 4 years for college, and then 4 years from 2018 to 2022. And when we had a kid, the dynamic shifted because instead of you and your missus and your animals living overseas, it's a bit more YOLO. And then you have a kid and you have more concerns for well-being and what happens if things go badly. And there was a sense in the US, the thing that I love is that a feeling like you can do anything and it's expected that you should really get after it, which is great and something I've always appreciated about living in America and Americans. But there was also this aspect where it felt like the government in particular, the bureaucracy, the that no one kind of gives a fuck about you if things go badly. So the largest uh, reasons, the most often occurring reasons for bankruptcy in the US, for example, is medical debt, which in Australia is a lot better. It's not perfect, but most people aren't in a situation here where they're going to go bankrupt because they have a medical issue. Whereas in the US, the chances that something could go bad and you're kind of shuffled out the door into homelessness or some terribleness is high. So we thought, okay, we'll go live in Australia because it's certainly better in that regard. And you are not trying to be pessimistic about potential outcomes, and the likelihood that we'll end up on the street is low. But you also don't want to chance it when you've got little people relying on you. And unfortunately, the last week or so, it has felt a bit like that, especially the last few days as it stretched on to 5, 6, 7, 8 days today without power. Yeah, not great at all. And I'm, hopefully today, right now, is the last time I'm talking about it, thinking about it, doing anything about it other than dealing with the implications, which at this stage, with a good generator, which I upgraded to this morning, is just keeping it full of petrol, keeping it going, plugging in as necessary. So this podcast, for example, we've got Starlink, this computer, all of it's plugged into the power board, which is plugged into the generator. So you may be thinking at the outset, oh, look, we're hearing from Cyclone Sam and he must have his power back. No, no, this is a willingness for me to do this consistently because I said that I would. It ain't easy or convenient. There's practical implications for having to deal with it, and in that everything takes much longer at the moment. Dishes need hand washing. We've been going to the laundromat. The moving about of chargers and power cords and power boards and generators has added hours to the day, in addition to all the stuff that needs cleaning up. As I said, talking about it feels a lot like complaining. So I'm going to start to put a bow in it. One thing I have been doing is reading a book that I mentioned last week, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is about his time and observations from his perspective as a psychiatrist or psychiatrist in a concentration camp in various concentration camps in World War II, and how I said that I thought before I read it, it was going to be a really depressing read. And it's not positive in the way that you think, as it is still horrific, but because it's mostly about how to see the upside in what's going on with you, that seemed like a timely book to take with me on the journey, to be able to read and engage with. Think about when we were dealing with some difficulties that realistically are a pain in the ass, but they're not the end of the world. I'd say no one's sick and injured. We're a little bit sick, some congestion, but nothing major. And it could be a lot worse. And it was a lot worse and is a lot worse for other people. Some guy got swept away in the floods. They found his body. That's worse for him, worse for his family. I'd imagine there's people that have had more damage to their properties. Maybe they've had more damage and they don't have insurance. That's worse. Maybe there'll be people that don't have their power to restore after us, although I think we're right down the bottom of the list, but it could be worse. I'm reading this book and thinking, okay, Sam, it could be worse. So maybe you don't, throw a pity party for yourself and your family. And I intellectually, I could understand all the ways in which the situation could be so much worse, but I kept coming back to, okay, it could be worse, but then how does that help me now? How does that help me feel better about the way things are now? What's the positive spin? And I was thinking, oh, okay, well, man, we're spending time as a family, isn't that good? And the reality is we spend a lot of time as a family, maybe more time as a family normally because there's less other shit to do normally. So we're hanging out doing the thing and working, and everyone's more attached to their purpose than has been the case in the last week. And my wife and I at various times weren't the best versions of ourselves because we felt helpless and don't feel great for the situation that it's put our kids in. And so it was an exercise and continues to be, not something that I can say, well, we did this and I felt better and therefore it was great. I'm more indicating that you try your best with the tools that you have, but sometimes it doesn't make you feel any better. It's about acceptance of what is. The thing that I would normally practice in the situation when I feel a lack of control is to focus on, oh, well, what can we control? And the unfortunate thing is there was both a lot we couldn't control, and then there was this large amount of gray space for stuff that perhaps wasn't outside of my control, but perhaps it was. So, for example, contacting the energy company to let them know, hey, I feel aggrieved by this circumstance, and I can see the issue. And I don't think your requirement to have helicopters to access remote communities is kind of the issue here. And I can see that our neighbors in most directions and on our street, across the road, down the road, that they have power because when I drive past their houses at night, I can see the lights are on. So it's hard to be at peace with how things are when it seems like the hope that might get you just over the hump is right there. And then if I feel like I can nudge the energy company towards a little bit more urgency, maybe that makes a difference and we get power restored more quickly, and then operations on the home front can return to something that resembles normal. So there's a sense of, well, I can control the outcome here, but the reality is not so much. So it's been a process of, although I'd say you want to focus on what you can control, you still have to then figure out, well, what is it that I can control and what is it that I can't? And my tendency is to think that I can control more than I actually can. And perhaps there's times when I need to let go uh, and accept, which feels very passive, but given the circumstances as they are, uh, that would have saved me some stress and heartache. And yet here we are. I did mention, and this is going to be, we're going to start to shift here to something more positive. And it's the stuff that I'd normally like to talk about, which is the things that pertain to training. I mentioned two books last week. One was Man's Search for Meaning. And then the other one, perhaps because I was completely preoccupied, couldn't remember, which is odd because I carry this book around quite a bit. I think it's because it's not a great title, but here it is. Healthy Intelligent Training by Keith Livingston. Is a Kiwi, and it's a book about a New Zealand running coach from the 70s, Arthur Lydiard. I say from the 70s, but that was basically the time where his athletes that he coached were the most prominent, most successful, although he did predate that and extend into the 80s. And I'm talking about athletes like Peter Snell and Rod Dixon and Murray Halberg, who might not be names that occur to you, but these were New Zealand distance runners that won Olympic gold medals and broke world records at every distance from the 800 meters to the marathon. And the book is about his training methods, which over time have been appropriated and adapted to modern athletes, but also misconstrued. The the thing that gets the nuance that gets lost is that because he was a proponent of a lot of running volume, and because he also released a book called Jogging, which is about how jogging, the idea is that this LSD, long slow distance, was his whole bag. That was basically the whole thing. And you should run lots and you should run at a pretty measured pace, long and slow distance. But there's far more to it to that. So there is a phase where it is a lot of mostly steady running, but there is more variance even within a given training week, but certainly over the course of a season. So there's a building phase, then a phase that emphasized hill repeats, which would be a specific strength building phase. And then depending on your event, whether it was 1500 or 510K or the marathon, as you got closer to competition, much like current training programs, you would drop a bit of that volume and build in some more specific training, a race pace, intervals. But things that are lost, even in the early phases, he included some slight intensity. So stuff at marathon pace, regardless of whether they were marathon runners or not. Also included strides being low intensity sprinting, so certainly overspeed, but without creating any fatigue or byproduct. So no lactic acid, but we're working the neuromuscular system and we're building volume. So as things taper closer to competition, you're not trying to build speed for the first time when you're building fatigue. That's something that you've already practiced. You've got this big aerobic system that you can then amplify in race conditions with more targeted work. And the philosophy itself clearly works because of the results, and those athletes would be fast by contemporary standards, although not as fast. But gee, we'll search in the archives here. I'm pretty sure Peter Snell ran a 144 in 1968 or 72, which is quick. His marathon runners were running under 210 back in the day. World records, Olympic World Championship medals from this small island, which, based on the current level of performance in track and field and long distance running, it's not exactly a hotbed of long distance running. They've got so many good athletes and they're great in so many sports, but it's not as though it's Kenya where there's the culture of long distance running. He also went to Finland and explained his methods, which they adopted and then were also successful with. So there really is something to the man and his approach that I find intellectually curious, but then I think about how that can be applied to what I'm doing. And there are some limits. For example, his base building phase is 9.5, 10 hours of running a week, which for an elite athlete is about 100 miles or 160 kilometers, which for me may theoretically possible. We'll find out. It's a lot of volume, which is going to be better suited to people that have a real inclination towards distance running to begin with. So it might be that those that engage with the process, it's self-selecting, and that if you can survive it and you have talent, you'll go fast, but it's not for everyone. This book and Arthur himself would say, no, you just need to run at a suitably slow pace, and then you build up the volume, and then your proficiency at that volume improves. So your speed improves so you can cover more distance in the same time. It's a good read. You should check it out. Check out Arthur Lydiard if you don't want to go hook, line, and sinker on that book, Healthy Intelligent Training. Great read. I come back to it as reference a lot. I feel like I've read it a couple of times, but it's one of those that I still learn quite a bit from every time I pick it up. Uh, the next thing I wanted to touch on today, because I've been asked about that, and because it has been not front of mind, but something that I've been working through for a little while, which is shoe selection, which for runners and for running is not unimportant. I've been asked, am I going to go down the super shoe route, knowing that some of the super shoes out there can improve running economy, which is just to say your output at the same effort by 3 to 4%. It's mostly in the Nike shoes, and I'd say the Adidas shoes. But I do know firsthand that Adidas just went and took Nike shoe and made their own version of it. Now, the complication is that a lot of the researchers that eventually came up with the first variant of the Nike Vaporfly, which was the first super shoe, which is the first shoe that just had a carbon plate and special foam, that was based in part on research and researchers that had worked for Adidas. But the recent variants have been more a duplication than an evolution. Many other companies have come out with their own versions of this, which is just running shoes with a large stack height and a carbon plate, which allow to basically propel the runner forward. The extent to which the carbon plate is providing that benefit is debated, because I know also from insider information that athletes in Kenya were provided with these shoes and they'd return them with broken carbon plates. This is the original Adidas Adizero Pro, and they weren't noticing any lack of performance. So I think it is more to do with the foam and the geometry of the shoe, the extent to which the rocker, it allows you to rock onto the ball of the foot, and the extent to which it propels you forward. When I was last running back in the day, it's mostly 2006 through 2014, so overlapping with my rowing career. That's just when I was running more consistently, and then not. There was no super shoes. And because I was a heavier runner, I didn't want heavier shoes. They felt cumbersome and heavy. And I thought, I'm heavy enough, so I don't want to take any additional weight with me on the journey. So I tended to wear the lightest shoes that I could, real racing flats, even for training. So minimal shoes was what I enjoyed and what I became accustomed to. But now the racing flats are these more maximal, high stack height shoes where you're expected to get more out of it. Whereas previously I just wanted to get the shoe out of my way for it to be a non-issue. Knowing, having worked in that industry and knowing what's available and knowing the performance benefit, of course, I'm curious as to how and when I might incorporate it, even though I know that that's something for down the line, because I'm just building up my running consistency now, as opposed to trying to peak my performance, which is a different aspect and not something that's urgent. You don't want to wait till then to try and start get into the weeds on that. So to that end, I did some investigation. Investigation basically means that I bought a bunch of shoes. I bought 3 pairs of shoes to try to see if there was a brand where the shoe, even if it was the high performance model, where the training variants felt comfortable and felt like an option that I could train in. And then I knew if they had a performance shoe that that would be something that would at least fit and make sense down the line. Because if you're going to drop $300 on a pair of shoes at the pointy end of a race preparation, I wanted to take as much chance off the table as possible. I didn't really want to go the Nike route because they look, I don't know, not great for me. And everyone that wears them that isn't an Olympian seems to, I don't know, I don't want to sound too judgy, just not for me. There is some like brand preferences. It's just from internal preference, the same, whether it's the aesthetic, whether it's for how a brand conduct themselves, whether it's because I've got this muscle memory from being in opposition to Nike for a few years. At the same time, I've got a bit of baggage when it comes to Adidas, and I still not in the habit of wanting to pay for anything from that company. I took most of the Adidas stuff, basically anything I didn't get from them that wasn't part of being my Olympic uniform, which was provided by that company in 2008, 2012. I still have that stuff. I don't wear it, but I had a lot of Addy clothes based on working for that company for 4 years, and now I don't have any or wear any. Although my wife still gets around it. It's not a big deal. It's not, I'll hate you to the end. It's just the issues with that company was based on very practical conversations where I got to understand how they felt about what matters with a shoe. And I know with real confidence that far more people in the company care about how that shoe looks on a shelf, even if that's a digital shelf, than they care about how it fits and performs on a foot. And the thing that matters to me the most is just how it feels and how it performs. They want a shoe to be sleek, whereas I want a shoe to fit my foot. And the practical implications of this ran into my shoe testing process, in which I bought a pair of Pumas, or Puma, if you're American. I don't even know how the Germans pronounce it. And Brooks, mostly because I'd read reviews of some of their training shoes, which is the shoes that would make the most sense to me now. Let me see, the Nitro Max Mag, the maximal Puma training shoe, big stack height, a lot of cushion, and the Brooks Ghost 2. So those are both similar shoes, and those companies have super shoes. So I felt if they felt good, I trained in them, I would know that there was a super shoe available for me when it made sense. I bought those and a pair of Ultras. Ultras are a shoe that they have a more natural shaped toe box, which is to say it's designed to fit on a fucking foot, as opposed to, Chinese foot binding version of a shoe, which appears more sleek visually, which is what they're trying to sell. Whereas Ultra is trying to build a shoe that respects the human anatomy. And those are the shoes that I was wearing prior to Adidas, and the shoes I've been wearing since I've started running again. And there was no limit to those, in that there was no issue. It's just that the high performance variant of Ultra is considered not as high performance, not as responsive as some of these other companies. So it's the Ultra Vanish Carbon 2. It's a decent shoe by all accounts, but it doesn't provide the performance benefit that some of these other companies provide. That's why I was considering some of these other companies. I bought 3 pairs of shoes, and Ultras, the Brooks and the Pumas, and I tried them all on. And even just wearing them on my foot around the house, just trying them on, the Brooks and the Pumas, they were pinching in on my feet. And if they're not comfortable as I'm standing there, they're not going to be comfortable on a run. And to me, even more important that a incremental performance benefit is comfort, because comfort is what's going to allow you to accumulate the most training volume, which is going to have the most training volume which is going to have a bigger impact on performance as compared to the shoe itself. And now, of course, I could wear Ultras in training and then a pair of Vaporflies or Adizero Pros or whatever the faster variants of Brooks and Pumas are. But I knew then I was going to have to sort of sandwich my foot in a narrow shoe when it mattered the most. And then that becomes something to think about. Whereas when I'm running, I don't want to think about my shoes at all. I want to put them on, tie them up, and then not think about them at all until I get home. And that's the thing that Ultra offers. So Ultra, just because I've got this here, I wanted to be able to show it to you. I'm not saying it's the prettiest shoe in the world, although some of the more maximally cushioned shoes from these other companies, I don't think they're pretty either. And pretty doesn't matter. It's more chunky than the shoes I originally ran in back in the day and would prefer to run in. But it does provide more cushion, which is more useful to me at this larger mass that I currently am. And even if and when I lose a few kilos, I'll still be a few kilos heavier than my prior running form. And so I'll take the additional cushion. And the thing I like about Ultras is I put them on, I don't have to think about it. What I'm hoping is that when it comes time for me to run the marathon and train more specifically for the marathon, which will be mid next year, that in the time between now and then, Ultra will release a Vanish Carbon 3, that it might not be a full 3 to 4% performance benefit, but if it's 2 to 3, if it's something, but it still observes my major priorities, which is comfort and lack of thought about how the shoe is fitting or what it's doing, where it's pinching. I think if you get blisters because a shoe doesn't fit right, then the running economy becomes less important. All of my shoes now, they're anatomically sound. I wear Vivo barefoots. I wore the Reebok CrossFit TR Lite, which is basically a powerlifting shoe, but it's the same thing as a wide toe box and is mostly zero drop. So all of the shoes I've worn for all activities, for lifting, for walking, for getting about life, I've been zero drop, formerly low stack height, wide toe box. I have to concede on the low stack height because I need some cushion now. But as much as possible, I'll have a zero drop or at least a low differential between the heel and the toe. So if you want to look more into zero drop shoes, feel free to research. It's basically just the angle at which the heel to the toe. So more differential means you'll have a higher heel. Zero drop means the heel and the toe have always made are the same height, and that's always made more sense to me. Now there is some performance benefit if that's raised, and then with the right rocker, the geometry can help. But the main thing I'm trying to do is have a person, Sammy, that can run a sub 3 hour marathon, not trying to find the funkiest shoe that can provide the most incremental benefit, regardless of how much it fucks with my experience because it's annoying and uncomfortable in training and competition. I'd rather just have a shoe that isn't in the way, which is mostly what Ultra has provided, which is why that's what I'm wearing and likely will for most of this. I'm going to answer a couple of questions now. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're kicking on. We're about 45 minutes. Thanks for being here. Thanks for all of you that are enjoying this and stay here till the bitter end. Sam, can you talk about your mobility routine? I really enjoyed this episode. Now, I think that person was referencing maybe not the last not Cyclone Sam, but the last solo Sam. Mobility, I think, is going to look different to different people under different circumstances. It could include stretching, it could include yoga, it could include dynamic movements. It's a sort of catch-all term, I think, for ensuring that your body works for the thing that is most important to you, whether that's training or life or ideally both. It's the management of your ability to move through motion, which could be specific to the motion that you have in training and competition, but motion in general. You want to maintain that. Even if you have, say, for running goals, you can ensure that you have sufficient and proficient mobility for running. But if you lose all lateral capacity, so the ability to move your limbs outward from your body because running doesn't require it, then the rest of what you want from your body outside of running may be limited too, and it will get worse over time. So it is a real use it or lose it type of thing. There's what my routine, and I would say routine is not the phrase I'd use. What does mobility look like to me? It's a few things. When it's going well, I have time that is dedicated purely towards it. What it looks like most of the time is me trying to include it around the other things I need to do. And it unfortunately gets deprioritized relative to the rest of my training because there's some scope to be able to survive and progress training and achieve my goals if mobility isn't prioritized, but there's no chance of achieving my goals if the running and lifting is deprioritized. And consciously or not, that's the how it plays out in that if there's limited time, I end up doing the essential stuff, and then the perceivably non-essential things tend to get pushed to the wayside. So when things are going well, and this is something I talk to my clients about quite a bit, say clients, people I coach, when it's treated as an equal priority, everything else tends to go better. So if I am equally focused on mobility as a priority, then the rest of my training tends to have better continuity because I have less niggles and I can train harder and more consistently. But on any given week, because I have other things to do, I have work, I have family, I have a property that I need to manage, I have my training, and it all takes time. And so on a given day, it might mean that the mobility aspect just it's intellectually important. Sorry, mate, just got something in my eye here. It's never not important, but sometimes I treat it as not important, and so do the people I coach. And then me and then tend to accumulate more niggles. Knowing this, I have the conversation myself as I do them. Hey, continue to make this a priority. And when it's a priority, I set time aside, maybe even a given day. So on a recovery day, training would be mobility. And the best version of this is sometimes that's just doing a lot of stretching that's specific to my needs. But, and I've said this before, when people just do yoga, everything else tends to go better. You just do yoga, the best case scenario would be go to a yoga class. The next best scenario is follow yoga on a platform. For example, my wife, she's a yoga teacher. She has an online platform, Considered Body. It's bloody good. Do that. I should do that. I can't go to a class. That's a little bit much of a stretch, although I'd love to at this stage. The next best thing is go to YouTube. There's so many classes. You could find yoga for runners or yoga for power lifters, and there's going to be something in there. There's a class that where the time is suitable to your circumstance. And the real upside is that instead of you doing the stretches and exercises that you think you should do, which is in part going to be based on your preferences, you do what they think you should do, which is going to reveal some of your blind spots. And that's the stuff that you're not going to do unless you are doing a class following someone else's instructions. And that's myself included. Even if it's something funky or any like, I would never, ever, ever be in this position when you've got, your leg over your head and you're smelling your own asshole. You're never, ever going to do that unless someone's telling you to. That's what it looks like to me when things are going really well. What it normally looks like, in addition to that, or when that's not achievable, is I try and put it around everything else in little pockets. I try and layer in opportunities. For example, this conversation, I say it's conversation, it's me just talking to you. We're not really conversing, but I'm sitting on the ground. I'm sitting cross-legged. At times, I can roll into a 90-90 position. I can roll into this. And so we're doing mobility right now. And it's not as aggressive or as focused as sitting down and doing a class or standing up and doing a class as it often is, but it counts and it adds up. So I try and do that a lot, which is to say, if I'm working on the computer, which I am quite a bit, if I'm talking to someone I coach, which I do quite a bit, or if I'm recording a podcast, which I do on occasion, I'm sitting on the floor and I'm doing some pretty passive stretching. At night, if I'm watching Netflix or something like it with my missus, that's another great opportunity. So although I just want to maybe sit on the couch, and sometimes I'm doing some soft tissue work, which can amplify mobility, but I think is not mobility in the way this question was asked, and the way most people think about it is more stretching. I do some of that at night, but I'm also doing a fair amount of stretching my hips, my hammies. I've got various tools. I'd rather do that than just sit there and feel as though this is just an hour where I'm getting nothing but entertainment. I'd rather the entertainment, time with my wife, and we're chipping away at the performance and health goals. That's the stuff that I basically always do. The add-ons that really help, in addition to taking time to treat yoga or mobility as training, so you've got a dedicated hour once or twice a week where that's what you're doing. Like, I'm going for a run, I'm going to go do this. That's the best. But the other thing that really helps is doing it before and after training. I tend to be better at doing it before as compared to after, and there are reasons for that. Before, I'm doing things, some dynamic stretching in particular, that I know is going to amplify. I'm going to feel better for training. It's going to prepare my body to work well. And I do that consistently. And then I train and I'm like, okay, great, that went well. And then afterwards, I know that more stretching specific to my needs as part of that transition into everything else I need to do would help. But because I'm both depleted in terms of nutrients, but also fluids, training here in this heat and humidity, by the time I get done with a run in particular, or even weights, anything, any training at this stage, I'm basically completely drenched, massive sweat losses. So I need to replenish fluids, electrolytes, glycogen, and my situation is kind of just disgusting in that taking the time to regain some poise, to decompress, and to begin the process of transition and feeling better is kind of off the cards if I'm sitting there in my own muck. And so I'll go and shower and start on the refueling. But then sometimes because of the other things I need to do, I don't come back around to do the soft tissue work and the mobility and the stretching that I ought to. Sometimes I do, but if I'm pressed for time, which I often am, and it feels as though it's indulgent to even do the training at the volume that I currently am, and as I currently am, even though that's a big priority, it's just one of several priorities I have. and those are calling, things to do with the kids or with work or with family or some boring logistical shit that needs doing, that stuff needs doing now. And so I feel like, oh, I've taken the time to do the training, and how lucky am I? Am I going to be indulgent and take this additional time to do the thing that feels less important? And things go better when I do, but sometimes it doesn't present as that easy. Over time, I'm not thinking to myself, how do I train harder? I'm thinking, how do I more consistently incorporate the stuff that allows training to work consistently and for my body to feel good and work well, because that's more of a limiting factor than my willingness or ability to work hard. So that's what my mobility routine is. I'm doing it right now. Question number 2. Hey, Sam, glad to see you made it back home and loving the podcast so far. Appreciate that it can be a catch-all term, but how important do you think direct or targeted core trunk ab work is in one's training routine? And how do you personally currently implement them as part of your work towards a 300 kilo plus sub 3? Do the words mean different things to you? Example, core versus trunk. How would you recommend they are implemented for a typical rower training 10 to 12 times a week, 2 or 3 of those sessions being in the gym lifting? Good question. This is something that I've oscillated with over the years. And just so we're on this, I don't really differentiate between core, trunk, ab. Like, there are nuances, but we're basically talking about the transverse, the rectus abdominis, the obliques, the erectors, maybe even the intercostals and the serratus, it's the arm, anything below the armpits to your tits to your hips, let's call it that, and in a 360-degree aspect. So it's here. It's your trunk. That's your core. That's, it's not your abs, but your abs are certainly part of that. And the need for it depends on the person and the activity. So if you struggle to maintain position doing the sport that you do, which for you is rowing, and if you over time can't sit sufficiently tall at the finish, or you're arched during the drive phase, so which is to say you've got some excessive curvature, you can't support elongated posture, you're increasing the vulnerability of your back to injury, which is something we want to avoid. So when it comes to core training, I think you're aiming for sufficiency more than anything else. And most people want to have some abs, and I can appreciate that. I think that people should have a six-pack. Like, that's just my belief, which means you should have sufficiently developed abs and low enough adipose tissue that you should have some visible abs. Although I don't think that is the goal. I think that's a byproduct of good training and smart nutrition. Some of that can be targeted ab work. For me, because you asked it, the stuff I do that's not specific core work, like deadlifts or RDLs, remaining deadlifts is what I'm doing at the moment, is my deadlift exercise. They do target the core, as does chin-ups and pull-ups. But the specific stuff I do is ab wheel rollouts. I've built those over time from on my knees, which is a pretty solid exercise, and to standing variants, although they're assisted. So I've got a band around my waist. I'm doing standing ab wheel rollouts, and it really opened my mind in about 2018, where I saw a 160 odd kilogram man named Sean Doyle. Very, very strong person, one of the stronger, top 20 heavyweight powerlifters of all time. One of the most quiet, unassuming men I've ever met. But to watch him do standing ab wheel rollouts at 160 kilos, now he's pretty compact, whereas I'm a bit taller and have a longer torso, which does make it harder, but it did make me feel like, okay, that's possible. That was 7 years ago. And actually starting to just now make some headway in that, mostly because I've treated it as more of a priority. The reason that I believe ab wheel rollouts are beneficial for me is that if I'm putting a lot of load through a relatively low rep ranges through the posterior, which is the back side of the body, so hamstrings, glutes, back, to me it feels like it's only right to put a proportionate amount of load through the anterior side, which is hard to do with a lot of ab exercises, particularly if you're looking for anti-flexion. So movements where you're trying to maintain position rather than a crunch where you're actively going into spinal flexion. So the musculature of the core is remaining rigid rather than promoting movement in an exercise like an ab wheel. Whereas in times where I've done a lot more crunches, be them on the floor or on a ball where I've done them loaded or not, they help to develop the visual aspect of the abs, the rectus abdominis, but they often seem to create niggles in my back, which defeated the purpose of doing them. So I don't do an awful lot of that anymore. I mostly just do ab wheel rollouts, which I believe would be a suitable exercise for you as a place to start if you don't have an ab wheel, although they're pretty cheap and pretty easy to get. You can start with a plank because it's not the same, but it has some of the similar aspects, and would time spent in a plank would help prepare you for doing ab wheel rollouts. Then you start ab wheel rollouts on your knees through a range of motion that you can control. It doesn't have to be all the way out, but it should go out so far as you feel like you can properly control the movement, which is basically just maintaining a neutral spine. I see people, they want to go all the way out, but the exercise can start to get a little funky, and it's going to put you in a really vulnerable position if you don't execute it well, again, defeating the purpose. So you only want to, with this movement, go through a range of motion where you feel confident. Then over time, as you build capacity, you can build range, you can build reps, you can slow down the tempo, which will all increase the stress. Then over time, you could progress to standing variation. So you've got a lot of room to grow with one exercise. There's a lot you could also do in terms of rotational stuff. And I'd also think if we're talking more broadly about the core, developing the lower back, the erectors, and how they interact with the glutes. And I haven't really included the glutes as, which is just your ass, as part of the core, but it's that whole, and your elbow bone's connected to your humerus. It's all connected. So the things that are near the other things that you're concerned about also matter. What was the equivalent I used there? I just can't remember how that song goes. And there's no elbow bone. Although there is a bone, it's not called the elbow bone. So you want to work on your lower back, your glutes, which means just the exercises that you would think like back extensions, controlled deadlifts. You can include some direct ab work in the form of planks and some rotational stuff, which you can either do standing or sitting on your ass, although I think that's going to be less of your priority. Use it as a tool to avoid getting injured and to help maintain posture. And what I mean by posture in this sense, especially for a rower, is you just want to maintain the position between your sternum and your belly button. So never allow that to decrease. You don't ever want to slump. If you don't want to extend either, but if you simply keep that in the same place, which either under load or under fatigue is going to be hard to do, but if you practice doing that under fatigue and under load, then you will most certainly improve the strength of your core. Final question, and then we'll wrap things up for today. And I like this one. Are there any lead-up benchmarks that you will aim for running? Example, 1:30 half marathon, 2 months out, 40-minute, 10K, etc. And the answer is yes. I have a couple. To begin with, I want to be able to run a 10K in 45 minutes at 145 beats a minute heart rate or under. I could, I've run a 38, 39 minute 10K before, but that would have been, like a really pushing it, not maybe not maximal, but there or thereabouts. What I'm trying to aim for first is running economy improvements so I can cover a certain distance, 10K, at a certain speed, 4 minute 30Ks, at a certain level of intensity, which for me, 145 is about the upper end of my aerobic capacity. So it's right around aerobic threshold, T2. So 145 is the high end of that. If I can cover that speed, cover that distance at that speed, it says something about my underlying capacity. And at that stage, then I would be able to aim for some of my more closely relevant metrics, benchmarks, is the operative phrase, which include a half marathon under 125. My best ever is about, I think, 127, 128 in training. So that would have been almost certainly after one or two rows, so under for some fatigue, but I could bang out back in the day, pretty consistent. Like under 130 was no problem. Getting towards 125, I don't think I ever went that fast, but certainly in that 27, 28 region was pretty achievable. So under 125. And then the big ticket item for me is to be able to run a half marathon under 90 minutes, to go home, rehydrate, take on a couple of gels, and then do 1,000 calories on the Rogue Echo bike in 60 minutes or under. So that's 2.5 hours of work at a pretty good clip. And I think that would be maybe a peak training day leading up to the sub 3 hour performance. When that occurs, whether that's 2 months out or probably closer for me, that remains to be seen. It'll be part of how things are going. I think that you need to have a plan for how you're going to get somewhere, but that you don't want that plan to be so intricate or specific that it doesn't allow space to deal with things as they are. Every time I've written a program, which is like day one, day 45, and it's all sets and reps and speeds, it's all determined ahead of time. It might logically make sense. But as soon as there's any disruption, and there always is, then the plan no longer makes sense. So the idea of benchmarks does make sense. And those benchmarks should serve to provide you and me with confidence that on race day, I'll be able to perform as targeted. That's where you draw your confidence from. And it also informs the training leading up to it, such that I'm training as much to hit those benchmarks as I am to hit sub 3 hours, because I believe if I can hit those benchmarks, then the sub 3 hours, well, if I can hit those benchmarks in good standing, so it's not a life or death experience, but very achievable, then the sub 3 hour is achievable. And I would feel very confident leading up to it on the start line that it would be at that stage a matter of showing up and delivering the performance rather than having to overperform. If I can achieve those performances in training, I will feel very, very, very confident to deliver on race day. So then training becomes about developing the attributes, be able to perform those training benchmarks, which starts to add some shape and character to what training needs to be then. And then it's working back from that to where you are now, and then allowing things to progress organically. For example, nowhere in my prior plans was there any intention for there to be a cyclone and to get displaced for the better part of a week and to lose power for 8 days and to get a little bit sick and to have some niggles. Like none of that really can be anticipated. So you need to be super flexible. I tend to take things very much week by week with the knowledge that at a certain point I need to be ready to go, but because I've got time, that allows some flexibility. So those are the benchmarks. They're not set in stone in terms of when those will occur, but the benchmarks themselves are. I think and hope that'll make sense to you. Thanks everyone again for being here. If you like the solo Sam variants, let me know. If you like the podcast in general, let me know. But better yet, let other people know. What really helps is to have other people listen to this. I'm sure there's ways the subscription and 5 stars here and 5 stars over there, but spread the word. Even if it's, hey, there's this Mad Hatter named Sam that talks to himself and occasionally regularly talks to very interesting people about training and related matters, then perhaps this would be the podcast for them if they're into that type of thing, which if you are, then you probably know people that are too. Send them here and we can all do this together. Thanks a lot for today, and I'll speak to you next week.